Good morning, everyone. Let me just start by sharing my presentation. Here we go. It's a pleasure to be back at AVERT. We were presenting last year as well, my colleague Sarah, Carthy, and I. Then we were still very much in the data collection phase, and now we have some results to share with you. So I'm very happy to be able to do so today. As mentioned, I'd like to talk about our project about understanding why some people who radicalize become involved in terrorist violence and others do not. A project that was sponsored by the Canadian government's Community Resilience Fund, as well as the Dutch Research Council. So just to get us started on a bit of background, I think by now it's quite generally accepted that most individuals who radicalize, well, you can make a distinction between cognitive and behavioral radicalization, right? So some people will adopt extremist views, but most of them will not go on to act on them in a terrorist fashion. So this process we see on the slide of radicalization leading to terrorist violence is actually quite rare. But what we're focusing on is the notion that being somehow behaviorally involved, so enacting your extremist views, can take a wider variety of roles or forms, I should say, than just being engaged in terrorism. So someone who cognitively radicalizes comes to embrace worldviews in which violence is legitimized and advocated. They can do a whole range of things besides getting involved in attacks. They might be recruiters, they might be involved in hate crimes, which are also violent but a step down from terrorism, propagandists, a whole range of things you can think of. And the main focus of our study over these past couple of years has really been to ask, okay, so what distinguishes people who become involved in some fashion in enacting their extremist worldviews from those who do so very specifically as terrorist attackers? Now, we're not the first to, of course, work on this topic. This is a small but growing, I would say, field of research. And there's been some really excellent stuff that we have made full use of in our own project as well. But let's start it off by just briefly explaining what we think sets us apart. So we think we have probably the largest code book that we've seen so far. So that means that we address around 160 variables. So we're really trying to get a real breadth of insights. So we've taken a look at the literature on involvement and non-involvement in terrorist violence, drawn our variables from it, and in the process, hopefully, we are capturing a lot of nuance. We're specifically looking at risk as well as protective factors for involvement in terrorism. And this is something that hasn't really been done all that much in terrorism research yet. There seems to be an emphasis on trying to figure out the risk factors for someone's behavior. But of course, as is quite common already in criminology, risk and protective factors are just different sides of the same coin. So we've been very interested also in asking questions like, what could have kept someone who embraced the pro-violence worldviews from actually acting on them by conducting terrorism? We tried to conduct measurements over time, meaning that where possible, we took a measurement whether a particular variable was in play, let's say before radicalization and during radicalization, and to see how this developed. Did a particular influence become more or less relevant? In other words, as radicalization went on. We emphasized primary data collection. That's also why our project took a good 2 years to get to the data collection phase. So in addition to open source material, we have quite a number of interviews. We've drawn from things like public prosecution service files, court records, and what have you. And I think something that we do a bit differently than the existing literature, and hopefully can contribute to it, is that our empirical focus is on European as well as North American cases. So we draw from a large range of countries, and hopefully that gives our project a good bit of generalizability as well. So perhaps just a brief look at methodology, and then I'll move us into some results, because I know it's also at the end of the day for you guys over there, and I don't want to get us stuck in details too much, but just as a bit of a foundation. So as I mentioned, we drew this, I think, quite sizable code book from an extensive review of literature, hopefully capturing a range of relevant insights, not just from terrorism as a field of study, but also things like criminology and psychology. And we were very particular in our case selection. So we're only looking at individuals who we can consider to have radicalized to extremism, being worldviews that openly advocate for the use of political violence to achieve revolutionary change. We based our inclusion criteria on academic definitions of what terrorism is, rather than each country's own criminal law statutes. And hopefully it gives us some uniformity in the cases selected. And it's good to mention that we're only looking at homegrown extremists. So people who traveled from, let's say, Afghanistan to the US for 9/11 attacks. We didn't consider those because by looking at homegrown extremists, we hope to kind of impute some level of, again, socioeconomic background uniformity, making the sample more comparable. And we engaged in loose matching on ideology and time period active, so that we, hopefully weren't comparing apples and oranges too much. All of this over a 2-year period led to a data set, which we call the Non-Involvement in Terrorist Violence data set, or NITV, of some 206 individuals split right down the middle. So we have 103 people who became involved in terrorist violence themselves. So they were involved in the planning, the preparation, or execution of an attack, and 103 extremists who, again, shared these kind of views, cheered on terrorist violence, did a whole range of other stuff to enact their views, but crucially didn't become involved in attacks themselves. And the data set's also split right down the middle in terms of ideological affiliation. We looked at right-wing extremists as well as jihadists, and you can see roughly the split in terms of North America and Europe. And the median year of birth, YOB, is 1980, meaning that I think we have a relatively recent sample that we're looking at, which will hopefully also give us some results with salience for the coming years and decades. I think with an eye towards the time, I might go over just as very quickly as a final bit of methodology. So just maybe to note that we did all the coding ourselves. Every case was anonymized. We engaged in integrated reliability assessments to see whether my colleague Sarah and I were coming at this from similar angles, which indicated that we did. Here's a little view of the breakdown of the primary data we used. So interviews, autobiographical materials, investigative files. And it's just important to note that for the results that I'll presenting you, these are based on all of the variables that were statistically significantly associated with the outcome being involvement in terrorist violence. And they were checked beforehand to see whether there was any influence from missing data or data that were missing at random. In the case that happened, those variables were excluded from further reporting. So with that said, let me move on to the two, I'd say, main sets of findings. So here I'm really summarizing, hundreds of variables across, as I mentioned a few times, a really long project. So there's much more to say about this than I can at this time and space. But I would like to share with you what we consider to be some of the key outcomes. So if we look at for instance, the results of our regression analysis, and if we combine that with some of the results from our associations between key predictors, we get kind of a picture of the various strongly relevant predictors and particular outcomes. So we see that radicalization processes are more strongly associated with an outcome in which these individuals become involved in terrorist violence when the following elements are in place. So we see this mostly for lone actors, so people operating outside of established groups, individuals who have, by and large, poor social skills, something that we've seen, I think, also more broadly represented in work on lone actors, individuals who are also slightly more likely than individuals who radicalize and do not become involved in terrorist attacks to have a diagnosed mental health illness. I say this with some hesitancy because on the whole, diagnosed mental illnesses did not play a large part in our results. So only a minority of individuals actually was so diagnosed. We also see that radicalization is more likely to lead to involvement in terrorist violence for people who become increasingly socially isolated during their radicalization. And as the next point says, to give you a few examples, this also means that they lose pro-social ties. So they might abandon or be fired from their job. They might no longer spend any time on their education. They might have a relationship that they lose over time. They might no longer be caring for young children or perhaps elderly parents. And in their place, usually then comes connections with people online or in reality that are solely focused on their shared extremist views, really kind of cutting out any other opinion, any other voice that could have given them a counterweight. And we see that these individuals have lower self-control, larger criminal antecedents, and access to weapons that enable them to put their plans into practice. If we, however, go over to the other set of this, I guess, type of findings, and if we look at which variables are associated with radicalization not leading to involvement in terrorist attacks, we see some other elements that I think are quite interesting and that I might try to mention just a bit longer, and also to emphasize what that might mean for prevention practice. So one thing that surprised us quite a bit, actually, was to see that involvement in an extremist group was, in a sense, a protective factor. And this was a bit counterintuitive, because I think Sarah and I were both used to kind of thinking of groups like Al-Qaeda or so-called Islamic State or the IRA as some premier exponents, really, of groups who use terrorism. But if we look at it a bit more broadly, we see that most extremist groups actually tend to socialize their members into not crossing this threshold. And we believe this has to do in large part with their realization that the state is simply a very powerful opponent. And that if they go towards terrorism, the most likely outcome is they'll be arrested or they'll be killed, and they'll lose all the benefits that these groups give. And with benefits, we also mean, in a very real sense, the comradeship, the shared sense of purpose, the feeling that they're belonging to something important, and that they are those who get it, how the world works, as such. And these kind of intangible benefits might be as important in many instances as using the group for a vehicle to achieve any kind of real political change. So we think that groups, extremist groups, might be a protective factor against terrorist attacks. The dilemma, however, that this raises for people in intervention is what kind of longer-term damage does allowing an extremist group to exist do to, let's say, polarization in society? And does it outweigh the risks or the potential benefits, I should say, of lowering the likelihood of terrorism occurring? So this was an interesting finding. We also saw, in contrast to people who do become involved in terrorist attacks, that those who don't tend to have higher self-control, better social skills, and interestingly, a familiarity with non-violent activism. So these groups bring together people who, for instance, prior to radicalization, were already familiar with things like running demonstrations, or perhaps running some kind of outreach or propaganda campaign, or trying to vie for seats in a local election, for instance, and who took with them, or who developed during their radicalization, a preference for such means of putting their still very extremist worldviews into practice. So, for instance,
sorry, just to flag, you have 2 minutes. Apologies.
Excellent. I'm almost done. So just as an example of this, we've seen many neo-Nazis trying to get into office, for instance, through local elections. And so the means are non-violent, but the end goal still very much is. These individuals who do not engage in terrorist attacks are also more likely to remain in pro-social ties. So they're somewhat contradictorily, actually, still quite tied to or invested in the societies they ostensibly want to revolutionarily change. And they have a higher likelihood of feeling some sense still of party political representation. So having a road towards far-reaching political change other than through violence, essentially. And that was really it. As I mentioned, it was only a snapshot of our findings. There's hopefully more to come if the reviewers are on our side, so to speak. But to conclude, we think that involvement or non-involvement in terrorist violence may be as much about the presence or accumulation of risk factors as it is about the presence and especially diminution, losing of protective influences that leave those risk factors more able to actually influence someone's behavior. And we hope that further disaggregation of radicalization outcomes, as we've done here in this very stark fashion, will have considerable potential for future work, with also a strong policy and practice relevant component. And that's it for now. So thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thanks, Bart. That was excellent, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions in the Q&A. Next, we have Assistant Professor Sarah Carthy, also from Leiden University, who will be talking a little bit about protecting against terrorism involvement, exploring the relationships between risk and protective factors. So, Sarah, similarly, I'll let you know when there are 2 minutes left.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you, Bart. Bart has made my job a lot easier, because what I'm talking about is a spin-off of that broader project. So that's helpful in terms of explaining the design. What I'd like to talk to you about today is a project or a spin-off exploring the concept of risk offset. So in particular, we're interested in examining the interaction, if any, between a risk factor for involvement in terrorist violence and a protective factor for involvement in terrorist violence, and exploring whether the relationship is indeed non-linear. The reason we're involved in this avenue is, and why we think it's important, is in large part to do with what Bart just mentioned, which is the heterogeneity of radicalisation process outcomes. So it's long been stated that radicalisation into terrorism is a heterogeneous hazard. Yet, despite this widely held contention that an underlying factor or causal variable for terrorism is unlikely to emerge, much of what we know about terrorism is informed by studies examining predictors and outcomes in a linear way. And this is particularly the case when we look at the link between mental health difficulties and involvement in terrorist violence, which has been termed the mental health terrorism hypothesis. Now, this debate is decades old. I'm sure the people in the room are very familiar with it. But for the purpose of contextualizing our study, I think it's important to maybe take us through a little history trip. In the late 70s, this inference of causality between personality disorders and terrorism, it largely arose by the observation that the perpetration of terrorist attacks was itself symptomatic of disorder or mental illness. But then moving into the 1980s, successive studies on members of terrorist organizations failed to support this link. So when members of terrorist groups were compared to demographically matched controls, we didn't find that the prevalence was more in the terrorist group than in the control group. Moving into the 90s, this idea of profiling terrorists was discarded, and the label of abnormality was ultimately deemed unfair to the terrorist. Moving into the 2000s, this observation of normality more or less continued, and terrorism became more plausibly explained through the lens of pathways and mechanisms of change. Now, in the last 10 years or so, there's been calls for more nuance, particularly as terrorism as an outcome becomes increasingly disaggregated, and we're starting to wake up to the idea that being involved in terrorism or even perpetrating acts of terrorism can actually look very different for different types of people. Recent meta-analytic evidence by Paul Gill and colleagues and by Kieran Sarma and myself have synthesized evidence in this area. And we've broadly found that mental health difficulties are not remarkably higher in terrorist populations than you would expect in a general population. However, there may be a lurking third variable that tells us where the relationship is notably salient. And what I mean by notably salient is the observation that mental health difficulties for so-called lone actors tend to be significantly higher than other perpetrator types. Now, what this signals to us is not necessarily that mental health difficulties cause lone actor terrorism, but it does signal to us that there's inconsistencies in the evidence base, and we might be overlooking the underlying mechanisms that are at play. Ultimately, we might be looking at this relationship in a linear way when actually it's more likely to be non-linear. Now, in order to establish that a relationship is non-linear, we need to be able to establish causality, right? It's very tricky with this type of data. So the data that's synthesized in this review is cross-sectional. The data that myself and Bart have gathered is cross-sectional. And you cannot establish causality with cross-sectional data because you cannot establish temporality with cross-sectional data. However, if an argument of causation or a non-linear model is in agreement with what we already know or what we've seen in other studies or other theoretical frameworks, an argument of causality can be more confidently established. And this is what's really bringing us to the social support literature. By social support, what we're talking about is the social resources that are provided to an individual at different stages in their lives. Social support is well established and linked frequently to diagnoses of various mental disorders. There's lots of different models positing why this might be the case. And we're certainly not the first to consider that social support or social isolation might play a role in the risk posed by mental health difficulties and various violent outcomes. It's been explored in the context of sex offenders who perpetrate alone, in the context of mass murderers, and indeed in the context of lone actor terrorism with colleagues like Paul Gill. It's important to say, however, that social support, and this is where we're getting to the nonlinear part of the study, rarely functions as a standalone predictor. Instead, we more see social support as a social pathway between a predictor and an outcome. So sometimes it can mediate or explain the relationship. It can be related to the predictor, also related to the outcome, and it forms this sort of model as a mediated relationship. It can also change the nature of a relationship, coming in from absolutely nowhere, not necessarily related to either, but still buffering or changing the nature of the relationship by means of moderation. When we look to other literature outside of terrorism or even outside of violence, we see these sorts of relationships quite frequently. So it might seem unrelated, but public transport use and subjective well-being, a predictor and outcome relationship, we often see that social support mediates that relationship. It explains why public transport use leads to subjective well-being. But moving closer to our own area, between poor mental health and hazardous alcohol use, we find that there's an interaction with social support there. Poor mental health and delinquency, we often find that social support mediates that relationship. Poor mental health and recidivism, we find that social support mediates that relationship. Common mental disorders and violence, we can sometimes see a mediated relationship, or it can serve as a moderator. And the onset and course of mental disorders and violence, again, more interaction effects. So by and large, it's well established that social support has a role to play when we look at the relationship between mental health difficulties and a violent outcome or adverse outcome, which is what brings us to the current study. So as I said, Bart has given a really good context for the design. Ultimately, it was a case control study with loosely matched cases and control. We used temporal timestamps, and we wanted to compare individuals who radicalized and became involved in terrorism with individuals who radicalized but did not become involved in terrorism. The research questions that we asked in this study, first of all, we wanted to determine, did the presence or absence of mental health difficulties or developmental challenges, we measured that as well, were they directly associated with involvement in terrorism when we compared with a group who wasn't involved, not a general population, another radicalized group. Then we wanted to see, okay, this social support, does it even emerge as a protective or promotive factor, and does it predict non-involvement? And then the crux of the study, we wanted to understand if interaction effects existed. So to what extent do social support factors either mediate or moderate the relationship between clinical factors, so any of the risk factors in research question 1, and involvement in terrorism. I'll shoot through the results because I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about implications. But on the first question, and Bart sort of alluded to this earlier, when we lumped in together notable symptoms of disorder and clinical diagnoses of disorder as an aggregate item, we didn't find that that predicted involvement in terrorist violence. However, we did find that the presence or absence of a diagnosed mental disorder was significantly associated with involvement both before and during radicalization. This was also the case, unsurprisingly, for a lifetime prevalence, which was captured across both time points. But direct effects were not observed for those with developmental challenges, which was an aggregate item of neurodevelopmental disorders and indicators of delay. It is important to say that while we did find that the presence or absence of a diagnosis was significantly associated with involvement in terrorism, when we compare the prevalence rates in the involved group or even across the entire sample, we do not find that the prevalence is above what you would expect to find in a general population. It's still well below. On the second question, we've sort of identified a risk factor here, but now we want to see, is there any protective or promotive factors that we can kind of identify and link in relation to research question 3. We didn't find, interestingly, that prior to radicalization, social support factors were associated with either outcome. And this surprised us because, you know, they were quite theoretically informed. So social isolation, being in a relationship, parenting children, being employed, family size, which had mixed effects, none of these were associated with involvement in terrorist violence when measured prior to radicalization. However, during radicalization, some of these factors really did emerge. Being in a relationship, parenting children, being employed, and low levels of social isolation were all associated with non-involvement. But getting to the third question, so we wanted to know, okay, do any of these factors explain where the relationship is salient, or do they change the nature of the relationship by means of a moderator? And what we found was that there was no real mediation happening. So social support didn't really explain why a lifetime prevalence of mental disorder led to terrorism, so no interaction effects there. But we did identify an interesting moderator effect. So family size came back into the equation, and although it wasn't really predictive of non-involvement, it did function as a moderator. So it changed the nature of the relationship between a lifetime prevalence of mental disorder. What we mean by this is that for those who had more than 2 siblings, a lifetime prevalence of mental disorder was more likely to lead to terrorism. But for those from single sibling or only child households, a lifetime prevalence of mental disorder, for those from single sibling families, lifetime prevalence of disorder was likely to lead to terrorism. But for those with more siblings, this was less likely to happen. So having more siblings seemed to buffer the effect somehow. Now, the implications of this, there's real world implications and there's also theoretical implications. First of all, I think we can say that the relationship is unlikely to be linear. And while the former is associated with involvement, it may not be an appropriate predictor of radicalization itself. Excuse me. In terms of intervention, it may be the case that the potential for prevention or mitigation is greatest during radicalization. Prior to radicalization, targeting these things based on our data didn't really seem to make much of a difference. But nevertheless, early childhood environments, they may facilitate the development of positive psychosocial profiles. So the family size, what's happening there, what it's indicative of, what that's related to. We've theoretically mapped that onto this idea that when the early childhood environment facilitates this development of positive psychosocial profiles, this can mitigate the risk, what a risk might eventually turn into, and buffer it ultimately in this non-linear model and a moderated effect.
Apologies, Sarah, just so you know, you've got 2 minutes.
Perfect. I don't think I need that, so that's fine.
No worries.
And I suppose ultimately these early childhood environments, they may represent this lurking third variable and tell us more about the mental health terrorism hypothesis. It is theoretical, and I think with the data we have, we're keen to see maybe, are there other data sets where we can replicate these findings? Are there other measures of social support that can be looked at in this way? And perhaps maybe there's other theoretical frameworks where moderator and mediator effects have been observed and could be really useful in understanding this really interesting relationship. Thank you so much.
Sarah, that was absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot to unpack in the Q&A section. Finally, we have Jennifer Dowling, also from Leiden University, who's going to talk to us a little bit about understanding the non-occurrence of violence in the post-Good Friday Northern Ireland, how the internal brakes on violent escalation work and fail. Jennifer, just so you know, I'll let you know when you have 2 minutes left.
That's great. Thanks so much. Good morning or good afternoon to all of you. I'm very aware that it's the last presentation here and very early start on this end, so I'll be as brief and efficient as I can be and hopefully keep your attention for another few minutes. My name is Jennifer Dowling. I'm a PhD candidate here at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden. Today, I kind of have two goals in mind. The first is to contribute to my fellow panelists here by exploring kind of another facet of non-involvement. So we've looked at kind of why individuals might become involved and why they don't, but I'm kind of looking here at, I guess, a gray area of why individuals do, but then go on to exercise restraint in their use of violence. And secondly, I hope to kind of shed some insights for today's symposium topic on intervention and prevention efforts. So within the short time I have, I want to first briefly introduce the overall focus of my PhD research, tell you a bit about kind of the focus of today, which is on restraint at an organizational level. And we'll do that by zooming in on the case study of the provisional IRA, which I'm sure many of you in the audience are aware of. And finally, as I kind of go through the presentation, I want you to keep in mind, if I was in a classroom setting, I might try and get you to answer a few questions throughout, but we don't have time for that. But I want you to keep kind of at the back of your mind how this kind of historical analysis can inform efforts today at preventing a re-escalation of violence. So kind of reiterating what Bart introduced, kind of where we're coming from here, this idea that post 9/11 research focus on why individuals did go on to become involved in terrorism, and what were the kind of main drivers or motivators of it. We're shifting the focus here to understand why individuals might not become involved and what are some of the barriers or limitations to involvement. So why, despite supporting political violence, do individuals not become directly involved? And related to this, which is what we'll explore today, is why do individuals who do join extremist groups limit or restrain their use of violence? And that's precisely today's puzzle. So at an organizational level, kind of what are these developments that might limit or restrain violent escalation? And why is it that one of the most notorious armed groups in history, the Provisional IRA, exercised restraint after years of a sustained campaign of violence? So what do we know so far? What can the literature tell us to kind of guide us on this question? So drawing on Busher and Bjorgo's definition of restraint, which is the process whereby militants either choose to drop, downscale, or limit an attack. And so it sees them limit their use of violence. And building the internal brakes typology really offers a framework to which to understand these processes of restraint. And it really allows us to ask what sets these perimeters of violence that are used by these groups. And the brakes typology, for those that aren't familiar with it, is kind of centered on these 5 underlying logics. The first being the strategic logic. So this means that if there are non-violent means that allow a group to pursue their objectives, which means they don't have to engage in violence, such as an example, engaging with the political process, this might limit their use of violence. The moral logic plays on this logic of appropriateness, meaning that the target of their attacks may change over time. So who is seen as a justifiable target might change over time. The logic of ego maintenance here, we're talking about how the group wishes to identify themselves. So you might see groups distanced from more radical flanks that actually use more violence as kind of the movement develops. The logic of outgroup definition here, we're talking about a process of boundary softening. So this can happen when, for instance, efforts at reconciliation happen, really raises this obstacle to escalate violence against former adversaries, which we'll see in this case study. And finally, the organizational logic refers to kind of developments at an organizational level that might limit the group's actual ability to acquire weapons, for instance, carry out attacks, or might mean that the organization adapts to kind of create spaces for non-violent activism. So this is the framework we'll keep in mind while analyzing this case study. And it's already been applied to multiple groups and extremist movements already. So that's why today we're really addressing a gap in the research by looking to apply it to the case of the Provisional IRA. Now, I hope there's no one in the room thinking this is a case study that is past, we don't need to know about it. Why are we looking at it? Well, I think it's really relevant for this question because they're a group that were able to sustain an armed campaign for over 3 decades. And within that armed campaign, they pursued this strategy known as the Armalite and the ballot box, meaning they were able to pursue their objectives politically as well as militarily. So why at one point did we see them opt for the ballot box over the Armalite, and why was this kind of process of restraint and pulling the brakes enabled during the 1990s peace process? So in applying the internal brakes, kind of 3 brakes were the most salient in this analysis. The first we'll discuss is the strategic brake. So this might be prompted if a group is skeptical about their opponent. So they might feel that they're no longer able to beat their opponents militarily. Of course, the IRA came against their more military powerful British Army throughout the whole course of the conflict. However, by the late 1980s and 90s, kind of enhanced counter-terrorism measures really squeezed the group's ability to operate and this constant fear of infiltration. And here I've included an image of the Lochall ambush, which is when a foiled attack by the IRA was stopped in its tracks, and kind of the highest death toll of the troubles they'd incurred as a group. And so by kind of this stage, like the early 1990s, a number of kind of targeting of their key operatives and attacks really kind of resulted in a number of biographical accounts referring to this mutually hurting stalemate with no end in sight really to the conflict at the time. The strategic break might also be prompted by political opportunities that arise. So remember, the group was heavily entrenched in politics through being linked to their party Sinn Féin. However, from an internal breaks perspective, it's really about how a group interprets these external developments. So what's going on around them and how they interpret it themselves. So unlike previous attempts at negotiated settlement, what was different about the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 was that Sinn Féin were actually granted a seat at the table. So this was dissimilar to previous attempts. And here we were kind of able to see them being noted as a credible political party while also remaining linked to their paramilitary wing at the time. Sorry. Oh, sorry, there was a glitch there. Thirdly, the strategic break might be prompted by concerns that they might undermine support from the wider public. So the continued use of violence during the 90s really prompted this widespread peace movement. So this is not to say that the wider public were not supportive of peace before this time, but a number of attacks, such as the Warrington bombings in 1992, that targeted not only civilians but killed 2 children, really sparked a nerve with the wider public. So this wasn't only the public, but also the wider Republican support base began to kind of lean towards this idea of a negotiated peace deal. And after Good Friday, this break kind of remained in place as you saw the Provisional IRA actually distance themselves from dissident groups that continued to engage in violence. So the example of the Omagh bombing here, which was the highest death toll of the whole Troubles, was actually condemned for the first time by the Provisionals after the Good Friday Agreement. The final aspect of the strategic break is that groups here might rein in on violence if they need to maintain ties with strategically useful allies. And in the case of the IRA and Sinn Féin here, to be seen as a credible, legitimate actor, support from the US, which is pictured here, Sinn Féin president visiting the US in the 1990s. He was controversially granted a visa at the time to do a state visit, which was controversial as many still didn't agree that they should be admitted to the peace talks, but it really signaled to the whole agreement that was on the table that peace was a reality and that there was an outlet for politics here. Moving to the boundary softening break. So here we're really talking about how boundaries with the outgroup over time can soften and thus raises this obstacle to re-escalate violence. And here's an image of Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness, who were historically on the opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. Ian Paisley representing loyalist and Martin McGuinness being the Republican side. They went on to share office in Northern Ireland and ministerial offices. And these kind of political relationships really trickled down to more grassroots community levels. And post Good Friday, we really see this work by stellar grassroots organizations working towards reconciliation with former prisoners. And this kind of us versus them divide being softened over time, which really is incredibly significant, which we'll talk about in terms of intervention efforts in the conclusion. Finally, in looking at the organizational break, these are the developments that kind of squeeze the group's ability to operate. So the decommissioning process to which they committed to meant that external monitoring really made it difficult for them to even be able to acquire, let alone use weapons at the time. And this kind of process of decommissioning, which was fully completed in 2005, led to group members openly advocating for their former members or those that were still involved to instead find their voice within spaces of nonviolent activism, which meant joining the political process and potentially other outlets such as their newspapers and other means to kind of spread the Republican ideology, but one that wasn't associated with violence. So a number of these kind of breaking mechanisms in place that really limited their use of violence in the lead up to the peace process. So this internal breaks typology provides a useful lens for us to understand how these external changing conflict dynamics at the time in Northern Ireland influenced the PIRA's decision to shift away from armed violence. In looking at this case, there's a combination of kind of three breaks that are the most salient here: the strategic, boundary softening, and organizational breaks. But of course, it's really important when we're looking at kind of these intra-group processes of how a group interprets these external developments, is kind of how they create these opportunities for the breaks to work. So they do not happen in a vacuum. And this kind of internal decision-making is heavily influenced by these changing dynamics within the group. And just to kind of close on kind of the topic of today's symposium, thinking of intervention and what can a historical analysis like this bring us today? And this is kind of why I was prompted to look at this particular angle, given the riots that were in Northern Ireland last April. So kind of this pre-Good Friday and its immediate aftermath, and zooming forward to today. So how, after the Brexit fallout, how kind of can we be sure or not sure about the likelihood of violence re-escalating? And I think the breaks can offer some insights on this. So it really kind of illuminates for us 3 points. So firstly, the importance of kind of this strategic break staying in place for the likelihood of politics and power sharing to be re-established. So as we saw in the lead up to the peace process, the importance of giving all parties a voice and a seat at the table. So not only those that were known political representatives, but those that still had linkages to various factions and paramilitary organizations. So in order to kind of maintain this stability, and at the moment power sharing is hanging in the balance, there's really a need to ensure that it is re-established, to make sure this outlet remains there for those that are aggrieved by the situation. Secondly, it really emphasizes the importance of external support and third-party interventions, which again hangs in the balance post-Brexit, as Northern Ireland is no longer part of the European Union. So these kind of external oversights are really important in terms of ensuring kind of stability and peace is maintained. And finally, I've been lucky enough to do some field work in Belfast recently and see some of the fantastic work being done by cross-community organizations working there with former prisoners, and also working really towards cross-community work and ensuring this us and them divide is not kind of re-erected in kind of sectarian form. Of course, these boundaries unfortunately still exist, but the importance of kind of this softening and kind of a growing middle ground is really important in terms of ensuring this kind of re-escalation does not happen, and ensuring these breaks stay in place for the paramilitary groups that are still there in Northern Ireland today. Thank you for listening. I hope to welcome any questions in the Q&A, but for now, I'll give the floor back.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was absolutely fascinating. We're going to open the floor to Q&A. We've got a couple of questions. We've got one. Whilst we're all thinking, I might actually abuse my privilege as chair, Jennifer, and ask you a question if you don't mind, because your research is really similar to some of my own work. It was interesting that you noted that the PIRA pursued both a political and a military strategy, and this is something that is not necessarily unique to protracted organisations, right? Generally, organisations that have been around for decades do pursue both. Reminded me of a conversation that I had with a former ELN political leader in Colombia that said that it was a deliberate strategy that the organisation would actually go on the defensive militarily, but on the offensive politically when they were leading up to negotiations. Then just before they were going to negotiate with the Colombian government, they would shift. They would do a massive attack. So they went on the offensive and then they went on the defensive politically. My question is, do you think that this internal break is zero-sum? So is it a matter of just zero-sum violence stopping or not? Or do you think it can actually account for, I guess, offensive and defensive emphasis on strategy internally?
Thanks so much for your question. I think that's very relevant in this case, because I think the frustration in looking at the Northern Irish case and kind of where I come at it with this kind of curious mind is how something can go on for such a protracted amount of time. And kind of what maybe I didn't get to cover here is over this 30-year time span, the amount of communication that actually went on, whether through political channels, through church channels, through all these different channels. And what you said about kind of the offensive, defensive was definitely prevalent here, in that you kind of see how during the 1990s, every time a ceasefire was called and the promises kind of were not met, or that they weren't admitted to talks, it kind of led to a re-escalation again. So I think kind of this breaking on and off is really not kind of a yes, no, zero sum. It was really protracted, it was complicated, it was definitely not just them and the government, there was multiple actors involved that kind of were crucial in kind of bringing them to the table and kind of succeeding in kind of this ultimate gradual process of restraint becoming a reality.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's super insightful. I think we had a question over here. Fantastic. Do we have a microphone?
I've got one.
Fantastic.
Already ahead of you.
Amazing.
This is probably more targeted towards Bart and Sarah, because my research actually looks at desegregating radicalisation outcomes using a database similar to your guys, actually replicated off a database Bart you mentioned early on or referred to. So I actually have a lot of questions, but I'm just going to ask one. It's about, you found that involvement or being a member of an extremist group was actually related to sort of non-involvement in terrorist violence, which is interesting. I'm wondering if in your data collection or your database actually collects the diversity of group membership or the types of groups. So, you know, instead of perhaps more formal extremist groups, were you able to capture more informal group membership? So, you know, smaller, close-knit groups that weren't specifically, you know, perhaps Al-Qaeda or ISIS? And did you find the relationship then change with the radicalisation outcomes?
So I think that's a great question, and thank you. We did indeed capture a range of groups. So this isn't just the big ones or the representatives in European or North American context, but I was actually surprised to see that most extremist groups are quite small. They're based on a bunch of friends, kind of a Sageman's bunch of guys concept, perhaps. So yeah, so we had a range of groups represented, but we didn't actively code for that. So there wasn't a variable saying, you know, representing a formal big organization or being a bit more, yeah, from the ground up, so to say.
Fantastic. I think we have about 4 more minutes for questions if anyone else had one. Otherwise, if you want to ask another one, you can. No, you're exhausted. No worries. That is completely fine. But I might actually have a really silly question, actually, because I noticed on one of your early slides, you mentioned hanger-on radicalisation. Could you unpack that a little bit?
So I think that might be a combination of the early hour and my poor Dutch to English translation skills. But what I mean with a hanger-on is simply someone who, or what we mean, Sarah and I mean, I should say, we see a lot of people who participate, for instance, in these extremist groups without having any particular role, right? So they're not really engaged in propaganda dissemination or recruiting others or financing, but they kind of enjoy being there, right? So it's just maybe because they're friends or it's exciting somehow. And then when things might really heat up is also when they are most likely to leave. So these are people who will kind of pad out these groups without really doing anything in particular. And this is actually a role, if you can call it that, that we think we see quite a lot. Perhaps most people who radicalize could be somehow positioned here. You know, they might like a couple of tweets, or they might, you know, share some of their own, but on the whole, they don't really go beyond sharing their views with their friends and discussing what is for them a hope for a future of violent revolutionary change.
Thanks, Bart. That's fantastic. If there aren't any more questions, I might give you 2 minutes of your morning back. So thank you so much. We really appreciate you engaging in the final panel, and everyone could say thank you to our colleagues in Leiden. Have a wonderful day, guys.